Turkmenistan lies between Iran, Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, and also used to be part of the Soviet Union. The country exports natural gas, oil, cotton, ships, textile products, among other things. But by far the most important export is that natural gas. They mainly export to China, though Europe has recently becoming a more important part of their export market. And most of Turkmenistan is either sandy desert or mountains, with the natural gas being extracted mainly from the lower-lying desert areas, including Karakum Desert, home to what's known as the Gates to Hell, or less dramatically, the Darvaza gas crater. The crater is a huge hole in the ground where natural gas from deep below the surface is seeping up towards the surface. All around the crater where the gas is escaping, the gas is actually on fire, and that fire has been burning for decades, leading to evocative names like Gates to Hell being used to describe it. And Turkmenistan is currently looking into ways of putting out the fires, partly for environmental reasons, in part because they're able to actually safely extract gas from the surrounding area. In addition, not wasting all that potentially valuable natural gas. The problem confronting the government is actually how do you go about extinguishing a fire over such a large area in very difficult terrain. And the fire itself is not a single fire, a whole series of individual fires scattered around the crater, and potentially could be put out one by one. However, tackling them on an individual basis runs the risk of the flames from another fire reigniting the fire once it's actually been put out. So to be successful, all the fires need to be put out at the same time. So three main ways of attacking a fire: take away the source of the fuel, take away the heat and ignition sources for the fire, or to actually deprive it of oxygen. Now, since natural gas is constantly making its way to the surface, there's really no practical way, while the fire is actually still burning, of taking away that source of the fuel. It leaves us with two options. In theory, flooding the area with huge amounts of water could cool the fire enough to put out the individual fires and prevent them from reigniting. But since the fire is in a desert, the only potential way to get enough water into the area would be to actually divert a river. Now, diverting a river has already been tried early in Turkmenistan's recent history, in an attempt to create a new agricultural land in the desert. But most of the water that was actually diverted was lost to evaporation, and it increased the salinity of the local soil. It's generally seen to be a huge waste of money in a country which is relatively poor by international standards. So, another grand water diverting project is unlikely to be approved. So it leaves us what seems on the surface the most unlikely option, but might be the only practical alternative: deprive the fire of oxygen. And while the fire is in the open to the atmosphere, stopping the oxygen getting from the fire may seem impossible, but there are a couple of potentially viable options. This can be done with smaller fires by flooding the fire with carbon dioxide or a similar heavy gas. Since the carbon dioxide is heavier than oxygen, it tends to sink to the bottom of an area, with the oxygen floating on top of the carbon dioxide, so separating the fire and the oxygen and extinguishing the fire. However, transporting the amount required to the area would be difficult, and the nature of the fire itself is creating a lot of turbulence in the air, so a strong updraft above the fire. This updraft means that the air directly above the fire is lifted upwards, and oxygen is then sucked in from the sides, feeding the flames. So even if you could flood the area with carbon dioxide, it's unlikely to extinguish the flames by this method. Basically leaves us one dramatic, fairly risky option: to attempt to use up all the oxygen in the local area in a single event. This method has been used to fight dangerous and out of control oil fires before, but never on something on the scale of the Darvaza gas crater. An explosion of some kind let off directly above the crater could potentially use up all the oxygen in the area, as well as sending out a shockwave which potentially could instantly put out all the fires, a bit like blowing out a candle. However, it's not without a lot of risks. The explosion could potentially fracture the rocks, opening up the rocks and letting out gas to flood the area, making the gas fire worse than it was before. It even spread the fire to another location in the desert via underground chambers in the rocks, doubling the current problem. The size of the explosion would also need to be substantial to be effective, as the fire covers such a large area. And nearby Uzbekistan, which once in the Soviet Union, did once use a nuclear bomb to put out a gas fire by placing the device in a shaft drilled down into the area surrounding the gas leak. They were able to both successfully put out the fire and seal the shaft that the gas was coming up from. Since the device was set off underground, radiation was actually contained in the local area. There was no contamination of the actual surface. This method again was an attempt to cut off the fuel for the fire by fusing the rocks together rather than attack on the oxygen there. However, the local circumstances of the Darvaza gas crater don't really allow the shaft to be drilled towards the crater, allowing a nuclear device to be placed near enough to the source of the fire and yet contain radiation from the device. So a nuclear solution is not really acceptable, and a nuclear device might not seal all the paths to the surface for the natural gas. However, there is another controversial weapon system which might be a suitable thing for the task, something called a thermobaric weapon. Thermobaric weapon, it's also known as a fuel or air explosive, creates a very powerful explosion for the weight of the device. Since the weapon is actually designed to use the oxygen from the surrounding area to actually fuel the explosion, rather than in a conventional explosion which contains the explosive material and an oxidizer all bundled up together to actually create the blast. So in theory, a thermobaric device may be able to successfully use to extinguish the fire at the Darvaza gas crater, both by using up the available oxygen and also creating that shock wave to blow out the fire.